and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I'm going to be talking about what I've been reading recently. So this is my weekly reading wrap up. Wow, that's really hard to say. Um, and I'm just going to go over what I've read in about the last week. I'm recording a few days later than I normally would, mainly because I had a lot of family in town, and while I was able to still keep reading, it made it difficult to film. I had no DNFs this week, which was nice, and I did finish a couple of books. One of the first books I finished was Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe, and this book I listened to mostly on audiobook, but I also occasionally just picked up the book to read as I had time, but I always like to have at least one audiobook going, and so for me this was it. This was written in the 1700s in England, and so there is a very different dialect that goes on in the writing style, and so it's sometimes easier to get into books from the 1700s, I find, if you listen to them on audio for a little while first, and then you get used to how they're speaking and you go from there. So Moll Flanders is a first-person narrative. It is what would have been considered part of the criminal biography genre at the time. And that basically means that, as it kind of sounds, it's telling the life story and struggles, still questionable whether there were struggles, of a criminal. In this case, that criminal is the young woman, Moll Flanders, and you follow her through basically when she's a young teenager as a servant in a family's home, and just all the things that happen to her as she tries to survive on her own as a woman in England. And while the book was written in the 1700s, Moll Flanders is technically supposed to have been written by Moll herself in 1683. So she herself is living in the 1600s in England, and she is just going through it, let's say, as she just tries to make it on her own. She is an orphan. She has people who have sort of taken care of her in her early childhood, but has no parents that she knows of to really take care of herself. And so she has to make it on her own. I think the most difficult part of reading this book is probably actually just the physical reading of it. Like I said, there was no standardized way of spelling or of sentence structure. Um, that was widely kept to during this time period, and so sometimes that can just be a barrier to entry to even understanding the story at all. One of the best things about this story, however, is that you just get a variety of different accounts of things going on in her life. Most of the stories are very entertaining. There is a very strong narrator voice as you listen to Moll tell her own stories and give her own perspectives on what happens. I think one of the funny things that happens in criminal biographies is one of the reasons they were interested at the time, and I think still are, is because they're just recounting a life of crime. And I tend to find that very frequently the criminals don't feel very bad about the crimes they're committing. Moll kind of tells her story in a very sort of tongue-in-cheek way. However, I find it very impressive that I feel like Daniel Defoe is still able to use her account to make some critiques on society. And you are constantly left with the question of, is she doing these things because she wants to and she likes to, or because she really has no other option as a single female? And so it's really sort of a entertaining way, if you will, to have society critiqued. And she does bring up the question a couple of times of, are you still reading this just because you like to hear about all the bad things I'm doing? And yeah, Ma, we probably are. I would recommend this book to anyone who's interested in reading about the life and times of a criminal and or just an average woman living in the 1600s. I would say this is virtually the polar opposite of what you're going to get from Jane Austen. There is romance in here, but this is not high society. This is not middle class society. This is not people living elegant lives in living rooms. This is Moll wandering the streets and inns and meeting all the men. This was a reread for me, and I'm glad I reread it, and I still really love this edition of it. I have discovered that I am a huge fan of Tor's classics, particularly their 90s editions, and I am now going out of my way to find more. I did give Moll Flanders 4 stars. I thought it was an enjoyable reread, but not quite as exciting as I remember it the first time, but definitely good, and I will keep this edition because I do overall really like Moll Flanders. I studied this book in college and still have fond memories of that class, and at some point, I think I'm going to try and find my notes on this book. The next book that I finished was Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier, and this tells the story of Mary Ellen, who is 18 and orphaned and goes to live with her aunt and uncle in the deserted moorlands of Cornwall. And she finds that life with them is not all it's cracked up to be, and that life with family can sometimes be more isolating than life alone. I felt this book was very atmospheric and mysterious. However, I didn't like it quite as much as Rebecca. That was the book that inspired me to read more Daphne du Maurier. I do feel like the writing in this was really good, probably not as good as in Rebecca. Unlike Rebecca, you do not have the strong first person narrative. And I would also argue that I'm not sure that I found Mary Ellen a very strong female protagonist. There were definitely moments where I felt like she was falling into the trope of a weak female who's helpless at times, but then there's other times where I felt like she defied conventions of the time. I would say the weakest part of this book and the part that really didn't work for me was I felt like the pacing kind of lagged at times, where you would have moments of high drama followed by just sort of moseying along through whatever. And it made the book feel longer than it is. So I was kind of surprised by that because I felt like Rebecca was very well paced, and sort of kept a strong narrative going throughout. I would compare the feel of this book probably more to the very last part of Rebecca, where they leave Mannerley and go into town for a time. I felt like that was a very off part of the book for me, and I feel like this book felt like the pacing of that maybe throughout. That said, I did find this still to be an unusual and mysterious book with a atypical love story kind of going on in the background. I don't know that I would say I like the way this book ends. I have a lot of mixed feelings about it, and I don't feel like it's because it's the type of ending I wouldn't like. I just feel like I'm not sure that I got bought into the characters enough to enjoy the way the book ended. I would recommend this book to anyone who would like to try reading more of Daphne du Maurier, or would even like to, give a gander into trying classics. However, honestly, if you were going to try a cat classic, I would say just go ahead and start with Rebecca and read that. I feel like it's much more engaging, and this is probably just a better book to follow up. I know some people really enjoy Jamaica Inn and really like this story, some even better than Rebecca. I personally am just not one of those people. I ended up giving Jamaica in 3 stars, and yeah, I don't know that I would say that I would read this again. It will probably be unhauled before I move. The next book I finished, I'm very happy to say, is The Arabian Nights. This is volume 1 of the Malcolm Lyons translations, and I finished it, guys. I'm so happy to say that. I Even though you're seeing this video, like, I think mid-June by the time this comes out, I did actually physically finish reading this book on May 31st, which was my goal. I wanted to finish it by the end of May, and I did achieve that, and I'm very happy to say that I did that. But just based on how my posting schedule goes, you're not seeing me talk about it until now. If you don't know the story of the Arabian Nights, the basic overarching story as to how all these stories are being told is you have a young woman named Shahrazad, and she has been given to the local sultan as a wife, or yeah, I guess a wife. They get married, and he is known for killing his wives after one night. And there is actually a whole story behind why that happens, but I won't get into it here. In order to try and survive the night, Shahrazad comes up with a plan to tell the king a story each night, but to leave it unfinished by the time he has to start his duties in the morning, so that he will be tempted to want to hear the rest of the story and come back each night for more. So she is able to accomplish that in this first volume by extending the nights for 294 nights. That's how many you get in this book. And overall, I really enjoyed these stories. I did think there were some stories in the middle that were kind of slow and very hit or miss as to whether or not I enjoyed them, and it did make the middle section of this particular volume kind of drag. However, I did enjoy quite a few of the stories at the beginning of the book, and there were some towards the end that I really enjoyed. I would have to say there was one towards the end that was my absolute favorite. This book is full of embedded narratives, which means you have one narrator who's telling a story, and then one of the characters in that story tells a story, and often they will be telling a story until you are like 4 or 5 narratives deep. Unfortunately for me, I was keeping track of this, and I did not discover until I was done reading the book that at the back of the book, there is an index of the night in stories where Lyons breaks down for you what the overarching stories are and then each of the embedded narratives. Gosh, do I wish I knew that at the beginning of the book. Partially, I would say that this is a really critical part of the book if you're reading this because all the embedded narratives can get really, really confusing if you start losing track of who's talking and what story you're in. Nice part of this is it also gives you the names of the story. And that's another helpful tool to track what's going on. I mentioned I had at the back of the book one narrative that was my absolute favorite one, and that in the back of the book is called The Story of King Shahraman and his son, Kamar al Zaman. And it has one main embedded narrative within it, and I also really enjoyed that embedded narrative. So I don't know how easy it is to find the stories in here separately, whether they're translated by Lyons or someone else, but that is definitely one of the stories that I would recommend reading if you want to give this a try. Probably the other overarching narrative that I really enjoyed was the one of King Umar ibn al Numan and his family. That has three different embedded narratives in it, but I think in that one, I enjoyed the overarching story, and it was hit or miss for me with the embedded narratives. But this book can really be a lot of fun. I just read about 10 pages of this each day, which I found to be a good amount. If I had have known about this layout at the back of the book, what I would recommend is to read one of each of the overarching stories at a time, or to just read one of the embedded narratives at a time. He does tell you where it starts, and you get a good idea of where they end. That helps keep the stories separate. It's much easier to read them as individual short stories than to just try and read straight through the book. Your mind will be spinning if you do that. That said, I really enjoyed this overall. I do have volumes 2 and 3 of this book. However, I am going to give myself a break before moving on to those. Overall, my enjoyment of this book stemmed from just hearing stories from a different culture and religious background than my own. I tend to find that the proverbs used are different, the metaphors and similes are different, and just the storytelling style in general is very different than what I grew up with. So it's always fun to read outside your own culture, in my opinion, because you just hear stories in a different way and you picture things in a different way than you otherwise may have. I would recommend this book to anyone who enjoys short stories, especially embedded narratives. And I would also recommend this book to someone who is just looking for a different story than what you may be used to or a different perspective, especially if you frequently read out of the Western canon. I think the major piece of advice that I could give, other than using that list at the back to help you figure out how to read the stories or how much of the stories to read, really, is to don't give up on it. If you find that there is a story that you're just not enjoying, just either keep reading through it or use the thing at the back and maybe skip that story, because I found that my enjoyment of the stories varied a lot from one to the next. There might be one or two that I didn't enjoy, and then I would find that the third one I'd really like or find fascinating. So, it really just depends on you and the particular story. Overall, I gave this volume a 4 star, and like I said, I can wait. I can wait to get to the next ones, but I know that I am sure to enjoy those as well. Like I said, I partially finished that many books because it's been slightly more than a week since my last recording, so I think I was able to sneak in a couple extra books that probably wouldn't have gotten finished if it had have just been a solid week. So now on to what I am currently reading. The first book, of course, is The Mysteries of Paris by Eugene. It is June, which means that Stormy and I are starting book 4 of this. Book 4 contains 20 chapters, so I am again just reading one chapter each day to stay on top of it. And the chapters are usually at the longest chapters are maybe 10 pages. So it's really easy to get in at some point during the day. This is a massive book. It is considered, I think, an urban drama or something like that, or urban mystery stories. I would also say that this isn't quite a criminal biography, but it's definitely about urban crime. So we have left off in this book in book 3, where we were hearing the very sad story of a very poor family. Eugene Sue is spending a lot of time talking about the plight of poor people and really the poor working class. and really trying to give his readers insight into what a difficult situation they're in. Book four opens up, and we are still talking and addressing the same issues that the family is going through and whether or not they can be saved. I would say this story overall is predominantly the narrative of a story of a handful of people who sort of meet in the street, and we follow their lives while attempting to unravel the various mysteries that surround their lives and those of their loved ones. I am enjoying this book and finding it to be a very easy book to pick up and put down. It was written serially, so the chapters that it's divided into were how the book was originally published, one chapter at a time, one each day. So I'm actually reading it the way that it was originally published. And I think that's working well. Though this is not a bad book, I'm just not finding it amazing or outstanding so far. But I am invested in the characters. I do want to keep hearing more about them, and I am curious how it ends. I'm also curious, like, what Eugene Sue's going to say for the next thousand some odd pages. Like, what else are you going to tell me about all this? So we will see, and we will, or at least I will see, and I'll let you know. The next book I am currently reading is book two in the Cairo trilogy, and that is Palace of Desire, right here. This particular edition is a bind up of all three books in the trilogy, which is why it's so long. But each of the books is probably only about 400 some odd pages. I'm losing my bookmarks here. Each of the books in here is only about 450 pages long, so they're not as long as they seem, though sometimes they seem really long. And Palace of Desire and this trilogy in general is following a multi-generational family saga. In Palace of Desire in particular, that book takes place 5 years after the end of Palace Walk, and Palace Walk mainly follows the father and sort of gives you a feel for his family and his children. In Palace of Desire, like I said, it's 5 years later. All of the children are basically at the point where they're considered adults. I think the youngest child is now basically college age. And you continue to follow the story. I get the sense that this story is going to start to follow the children more and more, but thus far, where I am at, we are still mainly following up with the dad and seeing how he has changed and or hasn't changed. And yeah, it'll be interesting to find out how he continues to move forward in his life. I don't want to say too much about book two because if you're thinking of reading book one, a lot of what I said would be a spoiler for that. Thus far, I am liking it, though I am finding the writing in book two is quite a bit different than I recall in book one. I'm gonna have to rest this on my shoulder. This book is so heavy. Book one, I remember there being a lot of just really interesting narration going on. In book two, I feel like we're getting a lot more internal dialogue than I recall there being in book one. I do remember in book one, we got a lot of the father's thoughts, but it just seems like as a writer, there has been a distinct growth in writing style. So I may want to look up at some point and figure out just how far apart these two books were written, because I do feel like not only have the characters matured, I feel like the author's matured as a writer as well in the writing of book two. So we'll see how this continues to go. I am in a little bit of a time crunch to read this book. Again, like I said, my posting schedule has you guys like seeing this video a few weeks after I've actually filmed this, but I am actually trying to finish reading this before I move. And as of the time of filming this, I am moving in less than 10 days. And I have about 300 pages of this still left to read, which is possible. I have figured out I just need to read about 40 pages a day, which is doable, but it's kind of a slow moving book. And so it's gonna be a time crunch. I only have one book left to talk about, and that book is The Mystery of Edwin Drood. I'm so excited. I have finally started this book. I wasn't sure if it was going to happen, and then the more and more I thought about it, I just realized I really want to get to Drood this summer. I really don't want to risk Drood going in storage with my other books and not seeing it for a while. And there was no way I was buying a second copy of it, and it's not that easy to find in libraries and stuff. So I decided, you know what, Nicole, buckle down, just get this book read. And so I've started it, and I'm so glad that I did that. I am reading this book both physically as well as listening to it on audiobook, just because I really want to make sure I get this book read and done. And yeah, it's going really well. Chapter one was really confusing. And it took me until chapter 2 to realize that was intentional. So I would say if you ever go to pick this book up and you read chapter 1 and you think, "No, I'm not doing this," keep going. Keep going at least for another couple of chapters because chapter 1 will start to make more sense. I'm so fascinated by this book. I have already reached parts in it that have reminded me why I like Charles Dickens so much. There's just so much wit and subtle humor in this book, and the characters again are all really interesting. And yeah, I'm just excited. And this storyline has already like taken turns and setups of different things that I just wasn't expecting, even based on reading the back, which I feel like is never happens with classics because I feel like you read the back and they tell you everything you could possibly want to know about the book, and then you have to find other motivation for reading it. I read the entire back of this book, and I still feel like there are things in this book that I was not expecting, and I'm really excited to start getting through it. I talk a little bit about what the mystery of Edwin Drood is about. It tells the story of the titular character, Edwin Drood, and his fiancee, Rosamund. These two have been engaged more or less so since childhood based on a family promise, and they are now getting to the point where they are coming of age and need to make good on their engagement. However, what I guess precedes is a bit of a town drama, to say the least, when Edwin Drood mysteriously disappears. And what follows is the entire, as the title says, Mystery of the Edwin Drood, which is just surrounding why did he disappear, how did that happen, and what really went on. I'm looking forward to getting more into it and finishing this so that I can then get on to Drood. And yeah, I can't explain how happy I am that I decided to pick this up, how much I'm enjoying it, and how much I'm looking forward to finishing it and finishing this book project. So that is The Mystery of Edwin Drood. By my next check-in, I will for sure have finished this book. That is it. That is everything that I have been reading this past week and working on and or finished. And yeah, I feel like I'm in a really good spot. I just have one daily read that I'm doing, which is The Mystery of Paris. I guess technically the Cairo trilogy is also a daily read for me, but I'm kind of, once I finish Drood, I would probably just be reading the Cairo trilogy, and so then that'll be the only book I read, and hopefully I'll knock that out very quickly. But I'm really excited with how the month is going so far, and I'm actually surprised at how many books I've already finished. So, especially since some of them are longer, but I guess I was in the middle of a lot of books. So, it's always nice when you're in the middle of a lot of books and then you start finishing a lot all at the same time. Anyway, let me know what you've been reading and how your month is going so far, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.